This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. Anyone, any questions that I can take before we can get started? So yesterday we were mostly looking into CIDR address blocks, RFC ranges called Class A, Class B, and Class C addresses. And very importantly, we were doing something known as service endpoint concept on what do you mean by a service endpoint and how do you, let's say, add a service endpoint to a particular virtual network subnet, and how do you how do you integrate a storage account with something called as a virtual network out here. So any questions with that particular concepts that I can take? So we had a couple of things like a virtual network, and inside the virtual network you had something called as a subnet, and we subnet which sits inside a virtual network out here, and finally we added something called as a service endpoint out here within the subnet. And finally I went ahead and I created something called as a storage account and integrated the storage account with this particular subnet of my virtual network out here. I have done something known as a virtual network integration with that particular storage account as such. Yes, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here that I can take? Are we good till here? Everyone, did everyone get these concepts till here? Now, the theory or the concept that I want to go into today is that can I do all these things using some kind of an automation, like let's say ARM template? Can I provision everything using an ARM template? Is where I want to go into. Again, I don't have a resource group. I don't have anything out here. I want to go ahead, create a resource group, and I want to go ahead and deploy that particular template, which creates a virtual network and a storage account and integrates both of them together. This is what I know, or this is what I want to do. Now we know that we know how to create a storage account. We do know that, but we don't know how to create a storage account and integrate it to, let's say, a particular. This is what we need to do. So let's go there. Again, I'll just open my VS Code today and let me open a particular document. I'll say open a folder. I'll go into one of the folders out here and say this is 8 a.m. ARM class 5, something like this. And once inside the folder, I'll say Control N, Control New. I'll select the language. I'll say it is ARM, Azure Resource Manager, and I will allow my templates to load. I'll allow all my templates to load and all these things out. Now let's do an ARM exclamation, load our basic template, load the basic structure, and then go into the resources and start creating resources today. And I want to create a couple of resources today, starting with the virtual network, subnet of the virtual network, and then finally my storage, and then also do a virtual network integration. This is what I want to do. So the question that I want to ask you all is that amongst these resources, virtual network, subnet, or virtual network, subnet, storage, virtual network integration, which resource do you logically think I should create first? Is it the storage or is it the virtual network? Virtual network?
Virtual network.
Why not? Okay, why not storage? Storage only. After virtual network, we create something known as storage. Right, but can I create it parallelly? Create both my virtual network and storage parallelly out here? Yes. What happens if I create parallelly? What happens if I create serially? Let's understand this logic before I move forward. So yes, virtual network first, storage second. I'll also tell you why virtual network is first, why storage is second. But my question is that can I create all of them parallelly to avoid, let's say, so much of time? Can I do a parallel creation? Yes, no, maybe. Can I do that? Yes. Let's try doing that. Let's see. Firstly, let's go ahead, create a virtual network. Again, the order of creation doesn't depend upon how do you write your resources. You can you can write your, let's say, storage account first, virtual network next. The order doesn't depend upon how do you, let's say, give this. You're just declaring resources. Something else controls the order. We'll talk about that. What I'll do, I'll start with ARM hyphen virtual network, which is VNet. I'll say enter. If you look at this template, it is creating a virtual network with two subnets under it. So subnet is acting as a child resource for this particular virtual network. So there's a concept called parent and a child relationship. Here, subnet are children of a virtual network. Do you see what is it's telling? Two children, subnet 1 and subnet 2. And if you go to subnet, it's telling what? Parent is your virtual network out here. So, so what they did in this particular template is that they took a block called subnet. It's an array, and they and they went ahead and created two different subnets inside this particular block. This is what really happened out here. So what I'll do is I'll just come here and let me adjust a couple of things like the name virtual network 1, but I don't want to hard code my name. I want to parameterize my name. So I'll declare a name called new parameter. I'll say vnet name. Again, a string value in the description optional. You can go ahead and give the description or not a problem. In here, what I'll do is I'll call my parameters function and I'll say vnet name up here. If I just scroll, there's something called type, and the type here is what? Virtual networks out here. Great. API version, I'm not changing anything. And location here is wherever my resource group is, go ahead and create the virtual network in the same location out here. In that way, I'm maintaining a consistency with my resource group, my resources that are created inside this particular resource group out there. And then you have tags optional in nature. So I'll delete the tags right now. I'll remove the tags, inside which I now have properties, very importantly, address space and the CIDR address block that I want to create using this particular, let's say, ARM template out here. So I'm giving a CIDR address space, which is 10.0.0.0 forward slash 16, which will give me 65,536 addresses. After that, it's telling subnet 1 and subnet 2. Now what I'll do is I'll only create one subnet. To make this template very simple, I'll take all these things out. I'll remove the second subnet out here. So I only have one child, and the name of the subnet is also something that I want to parameterize. So I'll come here, put a comma here, and say this is subnet name. And here I will say that instead of, let's say, subnet 1, I will declare parameters subnet name, inside which I have something called what? Address prefix of this particular subnet, just 10.0.0.0 forward slash 24 out here. So this is a virtual network, and also I'm creating a subnet inside that particular virtual network out here. My question is that am I missing anything else? I have the virtual network, I'm creating the subnet. Anything else that I'm missing on? In which resource group that I'm creating, but I don't really mention the resource group that I'm creating, and I deploy it inside the resource group. Anything else that I'm missing in the creation of virtual network and subnets out here? Anything?
Subnet
Anybody?
name also not mentioned.
I'm sorry.
Subnet name also not mentioned.
Not a problem. I'll mention it while I deploy it. While I'm deploying it, I'll mention the name of the subnet. That shouldn't be a problem out there. Anything else?
Specifications.
Specifications. What do you mean by specifications out here?
Like means how much GB you need, like 8 GB RAM or something else. Like,
No, that is, I have the address prefix number out here for virtual network and for the subnet as well. Okay, specifications, how much RAM I need and all that stuff. Do I mean, I never mentioned how much of RAM that I need and etc. While I created a virtual network, not at all. That comes later when you create a virtual machine, when you want a RAM and all these things. No. So virtual network. So let's come back into our diagram. What do we want to do with this particular virtual network? We want to take this particular virtual network and connect it to a storage account later. We want a, let's say, a virtual network and also integrate it with a storage account out there. If I want to do the virtual network integration, what do you think I need out here for a virtual network, or for, let's say, a storage integration out here? Services, or what is it called?
service endpoint.
Service endpoints. Exactly. Service endpoint. Without having a service endpoint, I cannot go ahead and integrate this particular subnet with that particular storage account out here. I cannot do that. In order to add a service endpoint, what I'll do, I'll put a comma here inside the properties of, let's say, that particular subnet, and I will do a control space. This will load a lot of things. One property that I want is what? Service endpoints. Again, guys, service endpoints is an array of resources that you can create, meaning you can have multiple service endpoints, like for storage, for SQL, and all these things. So it's an array. So if I put, let's say, a colon here, it's telling an array. I'll pick up this particular array, and inside this particular array, I will now open a bracket, and I'll say service. This is Microsoft dot storage. This is how I am creating something known as a service endpoint using the ARM template completely. So I do not want to go ahead and make a manual change. I want to, let's say, save all this configuration inside a template, and I then want to go ahead and create, let's say, all these things out here. So this is my virtual network, subnet, and also the service endpoint within that particular subnet out here, and all of which I'm creating using a template out here in my VS Code. This is the first block of resource. And if I click on this I button here, it will tell me what am I creating. It'll tell me what exactly that I'm creating. I'm creating, let's say, something known as a virtual, a virtual network out here is something that I'm creating. Let's close this. After this, I want to go ahead and create something called as what? A storage account. So what I'll do is I'll put a comma here. This is where my virtual network ends. And I'll say ARM hyphen storage account. This is what we had. And what I'll do is I'll parameterize again. We will say storage account name. I'm giving a parameter. Just scrolling down. I'll say this is parameters storage account name. This is what I'm picking up. Again, tags, since being optional in nature, I'll remove the tags out here. Location, again, I'm saying resource group dot location, meaning wherever your resource group is, wherever I'm deploying this in, please go ahead and take that particular location out here. Kind storage v2, I'll say this is standard LRS. Again, you can give a lot of things like allowed values and a lot of things out here, but I'm just going and hard coding all these things. It's a standard. Now I have my storage account created, but am I integrating the storage account with the virtual network? Did I anywhere mention that this particular storage account should get integrated with this particular subnet?
No.
Yes, no, maybe.
No, I think we can take networking function here.
We didn't take networking at all. Like we created a virtual network, yes, We are creating a virtual network. Yes, that's true. But we did not mention in the storage account anywhere that you have to go ahead and integrate yourself with that particular subnet. This is something that I did not do. So what I'll do is I'll do a comma, go down, and I'll open up a block called properties for this particular storage account. Properties. You can have multiple properties. So this is a list of properties that I can have. And I am looking at one specific property called network ACLS, network access control layers. So I'll take this particular property, and again this property is a list that I can give, and there are multiple things that I can give in this particular property, like bypass, like something called bypass, default action. It's a required property out here. Again, if you look at this one, this is not required, it's optional. Bypass is required, IP rules optional, vSource rules optional, and also what, virtual network rules. This is what I want to get into. And very importantly, I want to give a property called default action, which is required. By default, your storage account will allow all the traffic, all the internet traffic. I want to deny this. I want to say don't allow anything. Only allow the request coming from a particular virtual network, for which I'll do a comma. I'll say virtual network rules. Again, I can have multiple virtual networks and multiple subnets that are integrated. So I'll give a array, and inside this array, there are three things out here: ID, and what is it telling you? Resource ID of what? A subnet. Because if you create a particular, let's say, storage account and want to integrate it, you're not integrating it with the virtual network directly, right? You're integrating it with the subnet of the virtual network. I'll say yes, this is the ID of, let's say, the virtual network. But how can I get the ID again? Where can I get the ID from? Subnet ID. And where is the subnet? Virtual network. But do I see the ID of the subnet out here? Do I see the ID of that particular subnet? It's not asking for the IP. It's asking for the ID of the subnet. There is a difference between both of them.
Then after
Then where,
creating the storage record only we can know it, right? The properties can be implemented after service endpoint will come, right?
can you come again, please, with that one?
No, after creating the virtual network and storage account, in the last we can
Mhm.
get it right, I think. I means we can the properties ID we cannot get it run now itself now. After giving the service endpoint only in the last we can see it now.
In the last we can see it. That's correct, but that's correct. You're right. You're right in telling that. Let's say you get a storage account ID. For example, let's do one thing. Let's forget about our storage account. Let's delete this out. Let's come back into it, let's say in a minute. So I only want to create my virtual network first. Let's say I don't give the storage account name and all these things. So I'll remove this block also. Yes, you have a right point in telling, and I'll save this out. And I'll save this out in the form of a JSON file. And I'll say virtual networks. Save. And what I'll do is I'll just go back into my Azure portal, and I'll say deploy the virtual network or deploy a custom template. I'll say build your own template, then load the file, and I'll just go into that particular folder that I had. I'll say save. I'll pick up a resource group called demo RG. Say okay. I'll say this is EastUS2, and you have two things. Sorry, you have two things. One is called a VNet name, the other is called a subnet name out here. I'll say this is demo VNet ARM. I'll say this is demo subnet ARM. I'll say review and create this out. And this is running all the validations to check everything is good. Passed. I'll create this out here. So what I'm doing is I'm only creating a virtual network. Let's forget about the storage account right now. Let's create the virtual network and let's understand what do you mean by that particular ID out here. What do you mean by that particular, let's say, ID and all that stuff. So it's going ahead, creating me a particular resource group. Again, this is the resource group that it created called demo.rg. After that, it's going ahead creating a simple resource called virtual network. Within that, it's creating a subnet. And within the subnet, it should also add me something known as a service endpoint out here. This is what it needs to do. So this is Microsoft.network, virtual networks are not there, and it's all these things out. And let me wait till this gets created. And let me really see what really happens after I create this out. So I'll go into my resource group, or I go into the resource directly. I have the virtual network created in what? 10.0.0.04/16. And I have one subnet out here called demo ARM subnet with 10.0.0.04/24 with a service endpoint. I have a service endpoint also. I did not add this. The ARM template added this. Now, if I go and scroll down, there's something called properties of a virtual network. In this properties, I have something called as what? A resource ID. I'll copy this resource ID, okay? And let me take it and let me paste it here. Let me reduce the screen size a little bit. I have the subscription. It's telling what is the subscription in which I'm creating this in. Resource group, demo RG, providers, Microsoft.network/virtual network / let's say demo VM or demo VNet ARM. If I want the subnet ID, I'll just do a /subnets and then do a / and take the name of that particular subnet. So if I go into that particular subnet out here and go inside this particular subnet, so even this, in this URL also you'll have the same thing out here, subnets and then the name of the subnet out here. So I'll just take the name of the subnet and I'll place it here. This is my entire ID right now. And what ID is this? This is the ID of the virtual network subnet that I have. So I have a subscription. I have, let's say, something like the name of the subscription, the resource group, the demo RG out here. Providers, it says Microsoft.networks, virtual network, the name of the virtual network, subnet, the name of the subnet out here that I have. Now, what I would like to do is that when I create a storage account, so let me now add this resource called storage account out here. And I'll say this is ARM hyphen something called storage. I'm adding a storage account, and here again I'll give that particular parameters and all these things. I'll say this is storage account name, and then I'll say this is parameters storage account name, and then I'll remove the tags here, and then I'll say this is standard LRS in a tier called standard. Now, if I want to integrate this particular storage account with the subnet that I'm creating, I'll give a comma here. I'll give a comma here. Go into something called what? Properties. Inside the properties, I'm opening up a new property called network ACLS, which is network access control layers. And inside the network ACLS, I'm telling the first thing that I'll give you is something called what? Default action is deny. After that, virtual network rules. It's an array. It's a block of, let's say, rules that you can pass together, inside which the ID of what? The subnet, the resource ID of the subnet. And where do I get the resource ID of the subnet out here right now? I have pasted it in my notepad. Can I copy this entirely? This is the resource ID of the subnet that I do have. And after that, I will come here and I will say the action is allowed. And I missed a comma here. That's the reason it's throwing an error. Meaning, please allow the request coming from what? This particular subnet. So deny everything. Don't allow any request that is coming into your storage account from the internet. But please allow this particular subnet to go ahead and talk to your particular storage account out here. Getting this? So I created the virtual network. Then from that particular virtual network, I took the ID. And then from the ID, I went ahead and I created that. I mean, I took the ID and I went ahead and gave this ID inside my virtual network rules. But my question here is that, do you have a control on this ID? Do you have a control on how this ID gets generated? Meaning, if someone takes your template, deploys the same template out, changes the name of the VNet, changes the name of the subnet, do you think the ID will be the same thing? No. The ID is dynamic in nature. The ID will change from time to time. Again, if you delete the resource and recreate it, it'll give a, I mean, it'll give a different ID out here. The ID is something that you cannot control at all. The ID is dynamic in nature. So hard coding the ID out here will not make my template reusable. My template is not reusable. So what I'm telling is that even if I go to the portal and if I delete this out, I'll delete the entire resource group out here. This, for some reason, the resource group got deleted. And if the resource group got deleted, and I also, let's say this is fine, not a problem. And if the resource group got deleted, this ID is no longer valid. Now, if I deploy my template, it'll simply throw an error telling that I don't even know what the ID that you're talking about. So if I take this particular template out right now, if I go into the Azure portal and say deploy a template, I'll say load file. This is the file that I want to load again. I'll just save. And these are again two resources that I'm creating. And if you can also click on visualize here, it'll tell you what are all the resources that you kind of create out here. Very simple. It'll just tell you that you're creating a virtual network and a storage account out here. I'll say great. I'll create a new resource group called sample RG. Okay. I'll say this is East US 2. VNet name is something like demo ARM VNet. And this is demo ARM subnet. Finally, I'll give a storage account name called demo store abcxyz bcd000, something like this. And I'll say review and create this out. Validation failed. Okay, let's do one thing. Basics. Let's see. This is okay. Review and create this out. Okay, it did not took that basic information probably. So I'll just try to review and create this out once again. Validation passed. It's telling that your template is good. The validation is passed right now. And I'll create this out. And I'm now trying to deploy two things. One is a virtual network, subnet inside the virtual network. Second thing is the storage, and I also want to integrate my storage. But if you look what I'm doing, I'm integrating the storage account with a particular ID of a virtual network subnet that doesn't exist. I deleted it out. Didn't I? I deleted the entire ID out there, right? I deleted the entire subnet out there.